Now, this book, The Forgotten Cause of the Civil War, A New Look at the Slavery Issue, this book is very difficult to find, and apparently it's very expensive. I saw one price for 4,795, and in Amazon, but you still can't buy it, it's listed as $1,811.99. So obviously, when a book is like that, there's something in there that they don't want you to talk about, or they don't want the average person to know. And it's basically talking about Caucasians that were under slavery in the South. And they're saying that the person saying that that's the reason why the abolitionists were so gun-ho about getting rid of slavery. But it's just that in the history, we're taught that, it's surrounded about black people under slavery, and they have a problem with that. But they show you things that they want to show you, right? They don't want to show Caucasians under slavery because it looks embarrassing. So they just show black people, them talking about black people under slavery. But there were Caucasians that were under slavery. But they're saying that these Caucasians were mixed. But if they were mixed, then why do they pretty much look Caucasian? Because everybody's pretty much mixed. I mean, I probably have some Caucasian blood in me, like everybody does, and everybody has Negro blood or black blood. So everybody's mixed, but these Caucasians actually looked white. Now, I'm going to read the description. It says Americans are still asking about the reasons the Civil War was fought. Neglected evidence shows that a forgotten cause existed for the great conflict, a cause having to do with race and slavery. Although the first slaves in America were black, beginning in the colonial period and continuing up to the Civil War, there were many slaves who looked as white as their masters. Sexual relations between white and black produced a class of white slaves because by law throughout the South, every child of a slave mother was also a slave from the moment of birth, even after an endless number of generations went by and all discernible Negroid traits were long gone. Now, this is what I was saying for the longest time. Like, Caucasians and Negroes were getting along a lot better in the South than they were in the North. And this just proves my point because there's a lot of mulattoes. Okay, there's a lot of mulattoes in the South, and that means that they were mingling with each other. And of course, the Northerners don't like that. That's why the Northerners despise the Southerners, and we know that the Northerners didn't like black people. But most of our information about the South and about black people, about slavery, is coming from the North, a society that's clearly biased. But we're still regurgitating their nonsense. It's really ridiculous. And what's also interesting is that the racist, bigoted Northerners did not like the abolitionists because the abolitionists were trying to get rid of slavery. Even though the Northerners did not like slavery, they wanted to maintain it because that would mean getting rid of slavery would mean that black people could go anywhere in the United States. And the reason why they voted for Lincoln in the North is because Lincoln, the Republicans, promised the Western territories to be no slavery in the Western territories. Now, the Democrats were saying states' rights, let the people decide whether it's going to be free or slave states. But the Republicans say if we win, no slavery in the Western territories, meaning no black people. And that's what they wanted. They wanted the Western territories to be all white and all free. So the North was clearly a racist, bigoted society, but we're still regurgitating their nonsense. It's just mind-boggling to me. The existence of white slaves posed a threat to free whites living in the North, and this book is the first to address this racial aspect of pre-Civil War politics with the in-depth analysis it rightly deserves. If cause can be defined as any political or social dynamic which exacerbated the tensions between the North and the South, then white slavery certainly qualifies because it contributed to the deep-rooted friction which existed between the free and slave sections of the country. And yeah, that would make sense because the abolitionists were very antagonistic towards black abolitionists. They didn't really respect them that much. But you're both on the same side. But it's more likely because Caucasians were under slavery. Then that would make sense why they would be so gun ho of getting rid of slavery, because they were clearly aware that black people were having problems in the free system. They were clearly aware of this, but they weren't really concerned about that. They were more concerned about black people hundreds of miles away. That doesn't make any sense. That's so weird. So the whole thing about, Caucasians being slaves and they want to destroy that, that makes sense. But it's just that we don't really hear that in history books. But as I said, they could, write the history the way they want. They only show us what they want. Like black people were in Europe during the Middle Ages, but most of us don't even know that because they're showing one side of that era, right? You understand? Now where am I? Slavery qualifies consistent between free and slave state sections. Lincoln himself made references to slavery regardless of color, like quote unquote, regardless of color. The facts presented in this thoroughly researched text prove that white people were slaves in the American South, and that white slavery was indeed a cause of the Civil War. Don't think it was the cause of the Civil War. I understand the reason why the abolitionists wanted to get rid of slavery, but these people rebelled because they didn't like the results of the Republicans, because the Democrats didn't like the results of the Republicans, so that's why they rebelled. They wanted like a do-over. Moreover, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and a number of illustrations will be seen which depict actual white slaves and historical documents having to do with white slavery. I won't be able to see that because obviously don't have the book. Enough proof to convince even the most skeptical of these truths. In order to understand the present, we must understand the past. Tenzer's explanation of white slavery as the forgotten cause of the Civil War and his other examples of American history that have been omitted from the history books of our nation are certain to have an impact on race relations in America today. Okay, now I'm going to read the reviews because this is all I have. I can't have access to the book. Now, this one person says, makes you think, this well-researched book caused me to rethink the Civil War classes. I took it under grad school where information like this was never presented. To quote the author, to think that a young Caucasian man would leave his farm in New England to help free Negro slaves in southern United States is laughable. Well, it's more that it was a war because they rebelled. That's why they came down. It wasn't about to free slaves, it was about to put order back. But eventually it became to getting rid of slavery, which the Northerners didn't want. So if Lincoln wasn't killed by a Southerner, he was eventually going to be killed by a Northerner if the Southerner failed, because he went back on his word. Because now, by freeing the slaves, that means that black people could go anywhere, and that's what the Northerners did not want. So yes, there was another far more compelling reason for thousands of those boys to fight and die. It is a reason that the reader will find plausible, and by no means politically correct. But then again, Dr. Tenzer strives for correctness, not political correctness. And this other guy, I can't praise Tenzer's book enough. It is politically incorrect to point out the reality of white slavery, but it existed. Tenzer shows that the white southern slaves produced by a combination of racial mixture and the maternal descent rule were viewed as white people by Northerners, who had good reason to fear that any white person, mixed or pure, could be kidnapped. There's no real pure person, but anyway. Kidnapped by slave catchers and sold into slavery in the South. Tenzer also destroys the argument of those neo-Confederates who contend that the southern states, called the slave power in the North, were merely resisting the tyranny of a federal government. The slave power effectively controlled Congress and the presidency for most of the antebellum period. The three-fifth rule gave congressmen from the slave states the right to represent slaves, people who obviously couldn't vote, thereby giving them far more power than they would have received if they had made limited to representing free persons. Free states exercise states' rights by passing personal liberty laws to nullify the effects of the federal fugitive slave law. This law gave the accused slave no right to bring witnesses, have a jury, or any forms of due process. The judge was authorized by the law to receive a larger fee if he ruled against the slave than if he ruled in his favor. Tenzer also shows that when you consider the low wages of the average Southern white male, coupled with sharp rises in slave prices, slave catching was a tempting business. The slave catcher would earn more with one kidnapping expedition than he could earn by a year or two of hard labor. It's interesting because, like, aren't you supposed to? They would have to fake documents. You can't just grab a person and then say that, oh, he's a slave. You would have to fake documents and say that, hey, yeah, this guy's a slave, and this guy obviously would want to leave because he knows he's not a slave. They would definitely have to fake documents. That's I guess maybe it was easy back then to do that. I don't know. But anyway, many liberals historians asked why northern whites would fight a civil war to free blacks. They didn't consider equal. The obvious answer is that they saw slavery as a threat to whites. There was not only the issue of the white slaves, but the constant denigration of a free society by the intellectual defenders of slavery. Slavery apologists constantly stated that their slaves were better off than free white laborers in the North, which makes sense, right? I find it funny how when you watch shows and then the slave is free and they're doing the exact same thing that they did under slavery. And what makes you think that, Caucasians can attack black people? Well, they can actually attack black people even more because they're not slaves, because they're not property. They can attack them even more. And people don't seem to get that. Anyway, okay. More than that, the pro-slavery intellectuals defended slavery as a good in of itself, regardless of race or color. Tenzer shows that Republican Party political literature of the antebellum period took the threat of white enslavement seriously. One final praise, Tenzer defines his terms well. He reminds us that the slave power, or the South, represented the planter elite and not Southern people in general. Also, Negro blood by itself did not confine anyone to slavery. If the maternal descent line was from a white female or had been broken by manumission, the descendants were free. If the maternal descent line was from a white female or had been broken by manumission, the descendants were free. I have to look into that. Southern white persons could legally have more Negro ancestry than some unfortunate slaves. Interesting. I am still reading it. This is another person. I'm still reading it. Excellent work. I can understand why the left liberals, and especially those who bought off all the books from the bookstores, do not want this information public knowledge. I made the sacrifice and paid the stupid, unjust price of $350 for a used book that originally cost $19.95. The communists want to keep current Americans stupid and ignorant, obviously, of the truth. Several questions arise but one is, where is the reparation for the descendants of the white slaves owned by blacks? Okay, well, it's one-sided. We didn't even get reparations. And it should not be reparations for slavery. It should be reparations for the system that we're in now. Because that's the real problem. I will contribute more after I finish the book. It is mind-boggling to digest this surprised information. This other person says, holy sh... I thought so. The crap you read in the history books never made a damn sense to me when read. Now I see the cover-up. But as they behind closed doors here in America say, you gotta protect the status quo no matter what. The cat is out of the bag in this book. And this another person, great research book. Please adjust the price listing Amazon. The book should not be over $1,000 At most, it should be $50. Please adjust the price structure of this book. Great book. Would any of you like to sell your copy of this book? I'll make a good offer. Blah, blah, blah. I haven't read nor do I own this book as of yet. The reason for my review is to find out why this book cost almost $2,000. This is ridiculous, absurd, and appalling. Stop holding the information back from people. The truth is the truth, and it will come out. Truth seekers need to come together and get this on PDF. I'll contribute. And there's another person. Slavery was a curse on our nation from its founding, and Jefferson had to strike paragraphs decrying it from the Declaration of Independence or lose the support of southern states. It remained a hot political debate throughout the country's early history, but regardless of the strong feelings it evoked, no one was yet prepared to go to war over it. It's funny how they say that it's because slavery was around for such a long time. Obviously, it was successful. So it's just that it was a disciplined and law and order system. The stuff that they get away with in the free system, they wouldn't be able to get away with under slavery. And I guarantee you, if you had racist, bigoted people under slavery, once they get out of slavery, they won't be racist, bigoted people. They'll be civilized individual. And that's why the Southerners, the Caucasians and Negroes were getting along with a lot better because of slavery. Like, they were obviously intermingling with each other. They were having sexual relations with one another, and they were a lot respected. All those black people that got into positions of power after the Civil War, you think that they were just voted in by black people? No, they were voted in by Caucasians as well. So they didn't have a problem with black people. That's what slavery improved, and even women had had more autonomy in the South than they did the North. So there's that. Tenzer's book helped me understand on an emotional level what would make a northern farmer or tradesman pick up arms and go to fight his countrymen in this terrible war. What made a difference was the threat he felt slavery posed to himself, his way of life, and to his children and grandchildren. Yeah, but they weren't there. They were in the North. They were okay in the North. They act like there's like this epidemic of like thieving, taking white people or taking even black people and bringing them to the South. I'm sure that did happen, but was it an epidemic? I don't believe so. Even now, we hear of atrocities in faraway places and send money or write our leaders, but rarely get personally involved. Tenzer's thesis is that many historical events coincided in the middle 1800s to convince Northerners that their own rights and freedoms were or would be threatened by legal slavery and its expansion. He has the historical documentation to show that the eroding line between slave and free was much on the mind of average person and contributed to the country's willingness to take up arms over an issue that had so far only risen to the level of a disagreement. While I would like to think that the North was full of abolitionists so disgusted by slavery that they were willing to risk their lives to end it, Tenzer's book suggests that most were only willing to get involved when the threat became more personal. This is sadly consistent with human behavior and struck me as one of the best explanations for why the war happened when it did and received the support it did in the North. Oh, it wasn't to get rid of slavery. It was to, because they rebelled. They said that they didn't want to acknowledge the election of Lincoln. They won. They have a mandate. Their mandate was to not expand slavery into the Western territories. They won. That's they have to deal with it, but they didn't want to deal with it. It's not to get rid of slavery. That's not the initial. Anyway. Where am I? North, okay. Another part of the book that was fascinating to consider was the discussion of miscegenation and the historical situation of mixed race people. Too often the subject of propaganda and stereotype, Tenzer shows how statistics on mixed race people were manipulated to create notions of sickliness, really, and inferiority which still plague that group today. I was stunned to see how much of what was passed off as science then a very self-serving science for a small group of elites is still largely accepted as fact today. Yeah, like, anyway, not surprised. The Forgotten Cause is an important addition to every Civil War buff's reading list. It should stimulate lots of thought, including some worrisome questions about why this cause has been forgotten in our political correct times. Wow, it's just propaganda, isn't it? They just repeat the lie over and over again and people believe it. Then let's talk about race. For the reviewer who gave the book 1 star, how are you defining race? How are you defining segregation? To say that blacks received harsher treatment in South since the Civil War has some history behind it, but that ignores the treatment of blacks in inner cities, urban segregation of the North. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of problems in the North, but they don't want to discuss that. That's what gets on my nerves. Even Caucasians in factories working in mines, they don't want to talk about that. That was a horrible situation. It was a huge problem. Even after slavery got dispersed in the South, still the child labor laws were atrocious in America. Anyway, in short, when you generalize about race, you miss the point that race is and always has been a complex, shifting negotiation of power, privilege, and exclusion that affects people no matter where they live. As for the Civil War, the presence of nearly white fancy girls helped drive the abolitionist movement forward, especially in the mock slave auctions performed by Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother. In his famous Plymouth Church, many abolitionists were prejudicial about skin tone and held tight to a European beauty aesthetic. Yeah, they were not amenable to black people. They had a problem with black people. It's so obvious. But yet we're supposed to believe their version of event. These people are not propagandists at all. Of course they are. That slave ship Brooks, that slave ship is actually where black people are packed in like sardines that we see all the time. That ship never existed. It's just a drawing. That's the kind of things that they do. That's the kind of games that they play. In short, when northern whites pictured one of their own in bondage, the institution of slavery became all the more hideous. For more on this melodramatic substitution of victimhood, see Sadia Hartman's Scenes of Subjection. It was a process similar to, and I can't believe I'm referencing this movie, or this actor, Matthew McConaughey's closing statement at the end of A Time to Kill, in which he asked the white jury members to picture that the little black girl attacked by those white men had in fact been white. Empathy is a powerful thing, and most powerful when we can imagine ourselves in the position of another, which most white people didn't do throughout the centuries, which is one of the reasons why we had problems with white people, because they were ignorant. They didn't put themselves in our shoes. Obviously, what was done to us was hideous and nasty, and I'm talking about in the free system. But they didn't care. It's almost as if they didn't care. They dragged their feet. There was decent white people, but they dragged their feet in order to put these bigot racists in their place. It's like, why are you taking so long to, like, aren't you lovers of Jesus? Like, he would not condone this kind of behavior, so why are you letting it fester? It's just annoying. Please don't listen to the negative reviews of this book. There's no negative reviews. Please don't listen to the negative reviews of this book based on a historical and misinformed thoughts on race. When we look at race only in terms of skin color, we miss out on the history of a term that has structured American political, economic, and social life throughout history. This book answers the call for more complicated narratives about history. History, indeed, is always written by someone with an agenda. I keep on saying that. And the only way to get close to some sort of accuracy is by inviting various, sometimes conflicting approaches to what is never an easy subject. I just really focusing on their characteristics, because you could say whatever you want, but if I see that by your behavior you're doing the opposite of what you're saying, then it's like, because action speaks louder than words. And white people's actions, oh, we believe in God, we believe in liberty and justice and freedom for all, and like, obviously you don't. For black people, you don't. So it's so obvious. So why are you telling me something that's not true in your behavior? Anyway, the last one is strong evidence, painstaking research that may explain why the war to free the slaves did not provide any civil rights for the freed slaves until a second war a century later. The thesis that the capital owns labor is still alive, and this book provides evidence of intentions to make slaves of all workers, poor, black, or otherwise. Much of this mindset has not changed today. Only the catchphrases and nuances have changed. Okay. Anyway, that's what I'm saying. Like, white people, Caucasians were under slavery, and there are some photos that you see, like that I've shown you. Yeah, they were slaves. They look Caucasian. They don't look like they have Negro blood, but yeah, apparently they have Negro blood, supposedly, and they were slaves. It wasn't a big deal. But as I said, those racist, bigoted Caucasians, if they were under slavery, they would be better off. Because once they get out of slavery, they're not going to be racist, bigoted people. Most likely, they're not going to be racist, bigoted. No system is perfect, of course. Some people might slip through the cracks, but a vast majority of those former racists would not be racist once they get out of slavery. They'll be getting along with Negroes. Caucasians and Negroes are getting along a lot better in the South than they were in the North. And that's because of slavery, because slavery is a disciplined and law and order system.